folks. Great to be with you. I'm coming from a fancy apartment building in downtown DC where I'm giving a talk right after this live in person. Really grateful to have this opportunity to be with all of you. I'm going to talk at you about this new book for about 45 minutes, I would think, and then I'll try and tackle as many of your questions in the 15 minutes or so that remains. Great to be with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And I think if I hit maybe one more button right now, you can see my slides, hear my voice, and see my face. So let's get going. After 258 days locked below decks, John Moseley was unsteady on his feet. The second or third convict to stumble from the bowels of the ship onto this sun-baked shore near Botany Bay, he was also the first Black American to set foot anywhere in Australia, the newest outpost of Britain's expansive overseas empire. The Eora, the Aboriginal people living around the rim of this natural harbor, watched him with intense curiosity. A tall, dark-skinned stranger at the head of a line of pale, blinking men, women, and children, all dressed in ragged clothes. John Moseley's journey from the tobacco fields of Virginia to the tidal flats of what would soon be known as New South Wales had been a globe-spanning odyssey more than a decade in the making. The 17-year-old had bolted from his enslaver at the start of the Patriot Uprising in 1775 and had thrown in his lot with the British King's cause. He fought alongside redcoat regiments in several counter-insurgency campaigns in the Chesapeake in 1776, hoping that Britain would guarantee his liberty when its mighty military won the war. Those dreams started to slip away when the American rebels and their international allies eventually started to beat back the British. Moseley had to hustle to escape being captured, re-enslaved, and sent to work in a lead mine. By managing to make himself indispensable to his British bosses, he persuaded them to let him leave revolutionary America with them at war's end in 1783. In brazen defiance of the fugitive slave clause of the peace treaty the diplomats had drafted in Paris only months earlier. Moseley arrived in London without work or prospects and ineligible for poor relief or a veteran's pension. Desperate hunger soon drove him to desperate action, and he was caught forging a form to collect a missing sailor's unclaimed wages. Moseley had rationalized the fraud as a survival strategy and a victimless crime. But the judge at his trial at Britain's Old Bailey disagreed and sentenced him to 14 years of hard labor in the colonies instead. Back before the Revolutionary War, Britain had dispatched most of its convicts to serve out their terms in the North American colonies. But independence had put a stop to that. So guards shoved John Moseley onto a small ship scheduled to sail to a new penal colony on the other side of the world. He would spend more than a decade as a convict field hand in Australia, using a machete to hack long, coarse grass to feed cattle, and blunting axe after axe to clear trees to make way for rough-hewn huts and houses. In 1800, he received a conditional pardon after years of good behavior, along with a 50-acre land grant. Fully 25 years after escaping from slavery in Virginia, John Moseley was finally a free man, a settler, founder even. He put down his tools and abandoned agricultural labor as quickly as he possibly could, selling his 50 acres and finding a job in a small merchant house in the fledgling Sydney township. Once he found his feet, he launched his own business, proud to be working for himself at long last and for nobody else. The many journeys of John Mosley remind us that the American Revolutionary War set much of the world in motion. Convoys of Navy ships, cargo vessels, and even prison transports snaked across every ocean on this planet in this great age of sail, part and parcel of an unprecedented migrant crisis that sent great flows of people, soldiers, refugees, fugitives, and convicts alike, out towards uncertain futures in alien lands. John Mosley's Odyssey reminds us too that what began as a quarrel over taxes, tea, and indigenous lands metastasized into a global war. And it reminds us that the familiar events that took place in the 13 rebel colonies between 1775 and 1783 were intimately connected to far less familiar encounters and experiences occurring much further afield. Growing up outside London in the 1990s, I learned rather too much about the Spice Girls and rather too little about any of this. The kind of budget Hogwarts that I attended, all blazers and Latin declensions, history began with the Tudors. As my first history teacher told it, and my first history teacher was the gym teacher, it was thanks to Henry VIII and Elizabeth I that England defeated Catholic France, defeated Catholic Spain, and defeated the Catholic Pope himself, all while inventing naval supremacy and the Protestant work ethic. Then from there, we leapt over centuries of empire, slavery, and revolution in America to arrive triumphantly at the First and Second World Wars, our national curriculum's equivalent of comfort food. Britain standing alone, plucky, defiant, saving civilization twice. Did you know that Britain won World War II all on its own? Those omissions I'm describing were deliberate. The creation of national myths always is. To linger on the American Revolution would have been to dwell on defeat, humiliation, and loss. Who wants to teach schoolchildren that their nation once fought a war against farmers with muskets and lost? And yet somehow, the American Revolution managed to reach across the Atlantic and find me. And when it did, it changed my life. I'd gone to Cambridge University to study medieval European history, think popes and plagues and cathedrals. But I soon exhausted every medieval offering that a monolingual English undergraduate like me could manage in search of needed credits, preferably a course that met no earlier than 10 a.m., I ended up stumbling into a class on colonial and revolutionary America taught by Betty Wood, the woman on the right here, one of just 3 North Americanists at Cambridge, out of a full-time faculty of 73. What I found was a revelation. Wood was a working-class British northerner who had become one of the most formidable historians of her generation. She was brilliant and biting and funny. She made the history of colonial and revolutionary America enthralling and seismically important, and I've dedicated this new book I've written to her. Her classes got me thinking, and they got me reading, and quite frankly, I was hooked. Within a year of meeting Professor Betty Wood, I'd abandoned medieval Europe for the swamps, plantations, and battlefields of the Atlantic world and set off for graduate school here in the United States. But after I completed my PhD here, after I got married to a middle school teacher from Missouri, after I became a proud naturalized US citizen, and after I began to teach history to American college students here, I made a startling discovery. we in America have our own collective amnesia about the revolution. We definitely do not forget it. We remember it constantly. But we remember it selectively. We cherish it, parade it, costume ourselves in it, but we crop it. Like a family portrait in which only George Washington here and a handful of other founding fathers make the cut. Despite the Herculean efforts of our K-12 teachers, popular culture has taught our children a shrunken and sanitized version of the American Revolution. Most young people arrive in the first-year courses I teach at the University of Maryland convinced they already know everything they need to know. Jefferson writes the Declaration, Washington crosses the Delaware, and then Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. The Marquis de Lafayette, a French foreigner, might make a brief cameo, as he does in the Hamilton musical, but the rest of the world is usually left out of the frame. Studying the American Revolution in a bit more depth reveals that this narrowing of the narrative is itself a crucial part of the global story. By the time the ink was dry on the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the clear victors, the newly minted Americans, were already retelling the revolution as a self-contained morality play. The colonists versus the crown. David versus Goliath. The messy global reality of the war, that France bankrolled it, that Spain fought to recover lost territory from Britain, that enslaved and native peoples were both actors and victims, was inconvenient for the new project of national myth-making. The new nation's boosters needed to reduce the chaotic realities of the international conflict that had just ended to a neat and tidy origin story of plucky colonists triumphing over tyranny all by themselves. When American historians and artists first started depicting and describing the revolution, nearly 250 years ago, they gave short shrift to its many foreign entanglements. They preferred instead a simpler story in which homegrown heroes faced down all the king's horses and all the king's men, all on their own. And the British, eager to move on, didn't argue. The problem with myths, though, is that they stick. Generations of Americans have grown up with a revolution stripped of its entanglements, reduced to a few undeniably heroic yet simplistic set pieces. The result is that the revolution appears less as part of world history than as an exception to it, a story apart, rather than a story among. The truth, I think, is much more complicated and much more interesting. The revolution was from beginning to end a global struggle, upending lives from Boston to Belize and Botany Bay, from New York to Nassau and Nicaragua, from Philadelphia to Pondicherry and Prussia, and from Charleston to Cape Verde and Cape Town. The war in America provoked a father in one of the German states to take a hatchet to his eldest son's trigger finger to make certain his boy could not be conscripted into the army that his ruler had rented out to King George. The war in America led a descendant of the Incas to be brutally drawn and quartered by Spanish troops in Peru for trying to stage his own independence movement. The war in America led Chinese dockworkers to dump thousands of chests of East India Company opioids into the Pearl River in intentional homage to the Boston Tea Party. The evidence of this being a worldwide war is everywhere once we start to look, often hiding in plain sight. I see it in the overlooked statue of Bernardo de Galvez, the great Spanish victor at the Battle of Pensacola, moldering in a forlorn Washington Park about 2 miles from where I'm sitting. I see it in a storefront museum in Nova Scotia, where I recently stood listening to a descendant of Black asylum seekers recount his ancestors' journey from slavery in America to refuge in Canada, and then onward to West Africa. I hear it in the questions of high school students I taught in Taiwan this January, who wanted to know all about the East India Company's tea trade in Guangzhou, and far less about Thomas Jefferson's quill pen. Of course, patriot leaders understood the global reach and resonance of their great struggle for independence from its very beginning. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, worked tirelessly over these 8 years to kindle a civil war into a worldwide blaze. In 1776 alone, Franklin trekked to Canada to persuade the Quebecois to rise up against British rule. He drafted a German language handbill to provoke Hessian desertions from the king's ranks. And he set out across the Atlantic to try to secure military alliances with France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Over the next 90 months he spent in Europe, Franklin would continue to widen the American war in any way he could think of. He hired Irish sailors to raid British merchant shipping. He toasted the victories of King George III's enemies across South Asia, and he recruited a Prussian drill master to rush to Valley Forge to whip the Continental Army into fighting shape. Franklin was also responsible for engineering the Global Peace Settlement signed in Paris in 1783. That extraordinary treaty not only secured the independence of the United States, it also authorized this new nation to push back the Spanish Empire's encroachments into the Great Lakes region and seize vast territories from native peoples, redrawing almost every boundary line in North America and pushing Franklin's own fledgling republic's western border 1,000 miles into this continent's vast interior. Even the Declaration of Independence anticipated that the fight for America's future would be the work of many hands in many lands. On July 4th, 1776, an Irish immigrant to Philadelphia worked late into the night to set the final text of the Declaration into type on a printing press. John Dunlap was born in County Tyrone, in what today is Northern Ireland, and he had a contract to print all of Congress's official documents. By the following morning, he printed 200 identical printed copies on large sheets of Dutch paper, destined for distribution across North America and around the Atlantic world. Everywhere it went, the Declaration announced its grand purpose: informing the international community that 13 British colonies had formed a new political union that was eager to join the powers of the earth. This was not a simple courtesy notification. The delegates to the Continental Congress knew that they would need hard cash and generous credit from deep-pocketed trading partners, as well as more boots on the ground and massive naval support to defeat Britain. Just weeks earlier, in April of 1776, Richard Henry Lee, the Virginian who first proposed separate nationhood, had reminded his colleagues in Congress that no state in Europe will either make a treaty with us or trade with us, so long as we still consider ourselves to be subjects of Great Britain. Lee was convinced that a global declaration of the Patriots' sincere ambitions for independence was the only means by which foreign alliances can be obtained. Seen in this light, The document John Dunlap printed on the night of July 4th was actually a declaration of interdependence. This is why the delegates translated it into multiple languages immediately and sent copies addressed to King Louis XVI of France and King Carlos III of Spain on the first ships bound for Europe on Monday morning, July the 8th. It explains why John Adams drew up talking points for treaty negotiations with both nations just 10 days later. It explains why Congress dispatched Benjamin Franklin to Paris that fall. Those printed proclamations of intention and invitation reached Spain, Austria, and the Dutch Republic by the end of August, and then France, Denmark, Switzerland, Poland, and the Italian states a few weeks later. It would take Franklin and his fellow envoys many months of lobbying to persuade Europe's great powers to sign official terms of military alliance. However, Franklin and his team quickly secured their covert support in the form of money and supplies. As a result, the Continental Army soon received much-needed shipments of muskets and gunpowder sourced from arsenals in the French and Dutch Caribbean, and loans to pay soldiers' wages from donors in Spanish Cuba. The men and boys in George Washington's army who benefited from this bounty of foreign assistance were themselves strikingly pluralistic and polyglot. The Continental Army's senior ranks boasted volunteer officers from as far afield as South America and Eastern Europe. Many rank-and-file enlistees were also recent immigrants. And patriot regiments hummed with a cacophony of different tongues, accents, and dialects throughout the war. Among the Continental Army soldiers taken prisoner at the Battle of Trois-Rivières in Quebec in 1776, for instance, 89 of 200 Continentals told their redcoat captors they'd been born overseas. King George's own coalition was no less multicultural, multilingual, and multinational. Warriors from more than a dozen native nations in the Trans-Appalachian West helped the Redcoats engage rebel forces, as did perhaps 25,000 black fugitives from slavery like John Mosley. 19,000 resident white loyalists also supplemented British troops, as did at least 8,000 Irishmen and more than 30,000 soldiers loaned to the king by princes in 6 different German states. When coupled with the Royal Navy's initially uncontested command of the seas, all this manpower was enough to provide the British cause in America with a critical early advantage. Indeed, one of General George Washington's greatest achievements was to avoid being cornered and forced to capitulate to these intimidating legions in the war's early years. And Washington's wartime correspondence makes clear that he understood that the Patriots' most pressing priority was to divert British soldiers and sailors away from the American battlefront and tangle them up in costly, distracting operations almost everywhere else. Leaders in Congress agreed, and they sent out armadas of Patriot privateers to do just that, plundering British shipping around the Atlantic Rim and forcing Royal Navy warships to redeploy to convoy duty, which is a terrible use of a battleship. Of course, the Patriots' real breakthrough came in 1778 and 79, when the great fleets of France and Spain finally joined this contest. They set about turning all of the world's oceans into battlefields. Spain pushed the conflict into the Gulf of Mexico, the Mediterranean Sea, and the English Channel, while France went on the offensive almost everywhere else. You can see how critical French and Spanish naval power was by looking at their combined ships against Britain in this table. In the Caribbean, for instance, French admirals set their sights on the conquest of British sugar islands like Jamaica, the diamonds in King George's glittering imperial crown. Britain had to reassign regiments from tours of duty here in North America to garrison those vulnerable Caribbean treasure houses, and even abandon Philadelphia, the biggest prize the Redcoats had taken so far. Over in India, French strategists succeeded in forging a pivotal new anti-British alliance with Hyder Ali, the Muslim ruler of the Kingdom of Mysore. In 1780, he dispatched no less than 80,000 troops to try to seize a British stronghold in Madras. That Mysorean invasion force contained nearly 10 times the number of soldiers General Washington would have at his command as he led the Continental Army into battle the following year at Yorktown. As this brief survey suggests, the Patriots' great success in drawing foreign partners into the war was essential to achieving American independence. In fact, it was Patriot strategy. Britain lost not only because of Washington's extraordinary tenacity in the war's several familiar theaters on the mainland, but also because the King's men had to stage long sieges, wage desperate naval battles, and take mounting casualties on too many other fronts, spread too far apart. Leaders in London directed the fortunes of 100,000 troops during the conflict's climactic final stages. Yet those soldiers and sailors had to stretch across a vast global canvas, leaving less than 3 in 10 of them to try to rout the insurgents here in North America. Still, there was nothing inevitable about the outcome of the Revolutionary War. In truth, the Patriots' path to victory was a near decade-long slog, characterized by a string of very strange bedfellows, strained alliances, and dramatic reversals. No one ever knew what might happen next. That stark reality forced both sides to wage slash and burn propaganda campaigns to sow doubt and disinformation among their various enemies. Britain's loyalist supporters in America, for instance, tried repeatedly to weaponize their fellow colonists' reflexive fear of foreigners. The American loyalists spread ugly rumors that French Catholic soldiers had orders to persecute American Protestants, claim their lands for King Louis, and ban the speaking of English in New England. For their part, patriots like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere each worked hard to persuade Irishmen, Hessians, natives, and former slaves like John Mosley to defect to their side. Meanwhile, over in Britain, a vibrant anti-war movement there brought on motion after motion in Parliament to cease fire and lay down arms. From the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, to the last cannon blasts at Cuddalore in southern India in 1783, the revolution broke boundaries and crossed borders. Indeed, the decisive role played by international allies like France and Spain and Mysore is really only a small part of this sprawling story. While the United States rose from the wreckage of this war to take its place as the youngest member of the family of nations, many other communities caught up in it had to fight longer and harder to find their own footing in that brave new world. For enslaved Black people, The revolution was a fierce struggle to stage the largest exodus out of bondage since biblical times. For indigenous people, the war marked a dangerous turning point, stirring famine, spurring a massive refugee crisis, accelerating white settlement, and permanently transforming the balance of power in the heart of this continent. None of these men, women, and children were spectators to America's great struggle for liberty. They were essential stakeholders. And the stakes were enormous. Indeed, American independence was nothing less than a geopolitical earthquake. Declaring independence was an event of such power and magnitude that Thomas Jefferson later described it as an instrument pregnant with the fate of the world. You'll note that I lift that phrase and make it my book title. Within the British Empire, for instance, the war's shocks and aftershocks demonstrated that the king's hold over his overseas colonies was neither permanent nor invincible. That revelation prodded insurgents in British possessions from Ireland to Sierra Leone to take to the streets to assert their own ambitions for economic and political autonomy over the decades to come. American independence also cut the number of enslaved people laboring under Britain's flag by 500,000. That served to knock the pro-slavery lobby in London off balance and dramatically diminished its political power. Anti-slavery activists there sprang into action, leveraging this wholly unanticipated outcome to accelerate the rise of an organized abolition campaign there after 1783. The Patriots' dreams of liberty ricocheted around much of the rest of the planet too, pushing questions about human dignity, popular sovereignty, and citizenship toward the top of the global agenda, and equipping rights seekers everywhere with a potent new vocabulary. Of course, the Patriots' fight for self-determination did not break the grip of every entrenched political hierarchy. In fact, you may be surprised to learn that in some places it produced decidedly counter-revolutionary results. In the Spanish Empire, for example, senior ministers responded to events in British America with an authoritarian crackdown to try to bolster their own fragile imperial control. Nor did the rebellion bring on the abrupt collapse of the British Empire. King George surrendered 13 of his mainland colonies to the newly United States, but he held tight to more commercially valuable possessions elsewhere. The British Empire emerged from the maelstrom of the war arguably stronger and certainly much more ambitious than ever, having offloaded its most troublesome properties. 60,000 loyalist asylum seekers displaced by the American war fanned out to other British colonies in its aftermath. Their arrival helped to tighten the reins of royal rule over Canada, the Caribbean, and India, and extend the king's dominion further into Africa, Asia, and as we've seen, even Australia. My new book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World, traces the paths of this great war from its familiar epicenter outward to all these corners of the earth. I won't reveal all the crazy twists and turns it makes, as I want readers to experience all those surprises for themselves. But I will say here that you have not heard the half of it today. It's a wild story, a brand new history that aims to broaden and complicate a conflict too often perceived only as an isolated drama, while also advancing 7 big arguments for readers to chew over and wrestle with. First, the argument that the revolution stirred the mass migration and circulation of enormous numbers of people across a swirling, sweeping stage. Second, the argument that the war was not an inevitable march to patriot victory, but instead the highly contingent result of improbable choices and last-minute improvisations. Third, the argument that naval power was, of course, an important key to military success, and that what happened at sea often mattered just as much as what happened on land. Fourth, the argument that governments, soldiers, and civilians who wrestled for global advantage often acted on the understanding that trade was power just as much as territory. Fifth, that the human cost of this 8-year war was catastrophic for many of those caught up in its tides. Sixth, that the Patriots' struggle for self-determination stirred imperial authorities like these 3 guys to increase oversight and security over their remaining colonial subjects. And seventh, despite all of that this was a conflict in which the call for liberty rang around the world as never before. These 7 unheralded themes come into clear focus when we frame the Revolutionary War in transnational terms. However, this worldwide conflict was fought and felt on a human scale. I think that its impact is best understood through close scrutiny of the wartime experiences of individual people like you and me. So my new book is centered on the lives of about a dozen or so key characters. You've already met John Mosley. In the book, you'll also meet Molly Brant, the Mohawk woman who fought to preserve a fragile alliance between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown. You'll meet Baron Steuben, the flamboyant Prussian mercenary who worked to Europeanize the Continental Army. You'll meet William Russell, the Boston schoolteacher turned privateer who was taken hostage and thrown into a black hole detention site 3,000 miles from home. You'll meet Harry Washington, the black man who escaped American slavery at Mount Vernon and later declared his own independence against British rule in West Africa. And you'll meet Peggy Shippen, the Philadelphia debutante whose decision to persuade her husband to switch sides led them to flee revolutionary America in hope of starting over in India. She's wearing a wig, by the way. As the United States barrels towards its 250th anniversary, I fear that it may be tempting to return to the familiar, restrictive rebels versus redcoats script. But I think we should try to resist that impulse if we can. Because to recover the wider history of America's founding fight is to tell not only a truer, but a much richer and more compelling story. It will mean asking the Sons of Liberty to share the stage with indigenous warriors and enslaved Black Americans who saw this war as their best chance for freedom. It will mean setting the signers of the Declaration of Independence alongside Chinese tea pickers, Sierra Leonean separatists, Irish privateers, German deserters, French sailors, Spanish blanket weavers, loyalist war widows, British pacifists, South Asian rulers, and Jamaican washerwomen. In short, the great opportunity we have before us as we stand on the precipice of 2026 is to imagine America's founding struggle in post-exceptional terms as part of a global convulsion. And it's one of the central creation stories in the making of our modern world. I hope you'll join me in taking the plunge. Thanks very much indeed for listening to my prepared remarks. I'm looking forward, with Anthony's direction, to taking some of your comments and questions. And for those of you who might need to reach out to me directly for any reason, I've left my email on this final slide here. Anthony.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Fascinating as always. Thank you so much for that deep dive. And so we do have a bunch of questions already, but I just want to remind everyone, if you would like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box or the chat. And then if you're on any other platform, you can put it in the chat and we will be answering them now. All right, let's get started. So I've got a few here so the first one's from Robert. He wanted to know that you mentioned that the Declaration of Independence was sent to Prussia, Poland, and Italy, besides France, Spain, and the Dutch. Did these three countries provide support, money, supplies to the American cause?
Yeah, good question. So I'll just unpick the word sent there. I said copies of the Declaration arrived in those places Bob just named there. And separately, I said that copies were sent to France and Spain. Both of those things are true. The copies that the transcriptions of the Declaration end up in places like Prussia and Denmark and the German states. They're usually transcriptions copied from the London papers rather than directly sent there by the patriots in Philadelphia. What I should tell you is that the London papers get hold of the text of the Declaration much earlier than the rest of Europe, because British officers keep capturing copies of the Declaration circulating in America, and they grab them, let's say in New York, and they say, oh my God, what's this? We should tell our bosses back in London. So they mail copies, about 3 or 4 copies of the Declaration, to their bosses in London. Their bosses in London read them. The newspapers get hold of them. The newspapers publish the Declaration in London, and then European newspapers copy the text from the London papers. So we certainly know that the patriots were interested in seeking formal alliances with Prussia and Poland and other places in Europe, but none of those efforts bore fruit in the time available, in part because, Britain is freezing many European powers in place because those European powers don't want to antagonize Britain in the long-running saga of European sort of statecraft there. So, for instance, while Empress Catherine is encouraged to join the patriots and encouraged to rent troops to the king, this is Empress Catherine of Russia, of course, she decides to remain technically neutral, but instead form her own league of armed neutrality to basically mop up all the trading opportunities that Britain and the patriots leave on the table while they're fighting each other. So what I'm saying here is that other European powers are certainly invited by one side or the other, but most of them choose to stay out of it so that they can trade with as many other parties as possible. I hope that makes a bit of sense.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to combine some questions here so we can kind of stay on a little bit of a theme here. So Tyler, he asked, you highlight ordinary people impacted by the revolution. How did you decide which lives to examine, and what did those choices let you show that diplomatic and military history alone cannot?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Tyler. I've got a lot of time for historians who do good diplomatic history, who do good military history. I sometimes think military history gets a bad rap. It's often really good these days. There's great books on war and society, for instance, and the cost to people on the home front of armies moving through different places. So I've read basically every book about the American Revolution I can in order to write this sort of synthetic work. But nonetheless, I didn't want to write a global history of the American Revolution that just plods day by day through a 400-week-long war that ranges across the globe. Because think about what that would look like on the page, Tyler. It would mean that, on any given day of the war, I would say, in Boston, this was happening, new paragraph. Meanwhile, in India, this was happening, new paragraph. Meanwhile, in Poland, this was happening. And that would be incredibly tedious for readers to read and for me to write, and it wouldn't add up to much. It would add up to a slog. So I broke up the structure of this book very differently to that. I broke it up into 14, let's call them thematic chapters, which take on one chapter at a time, one topic at a time. So for instance, the first chapter, which begins in China, is about the Boston Tea Party as an event in global commercial history, right? Chinese tea carried by an East Asian company being passed through London on its way to Boston to compete with Dutch smugglers who gin up the Patriots in opposition to it. The second chapter is about how the American Revolution looks in Britain, how British people respond to King George's war against his own people. Do they all cheer and say, stick it to them, George? Or do they have reservations? And it turns out that the country we now call the United Kingdom was deeply disunited about whether King George's war was a good idea. Other chapters go to the Caribbean, into the Spanish alliance, the French alliance, to India, and to Central America, to West Africa, you name it. And several of those chapters, Tyler, I had the opportunity, or I saw an opportunity, to choose one human life as my vessel, my lens into a big topic. And I chose carefully, and there were many chapters where you couldn't do it with just one person, so you did it with several people. But in 5 chapters, I chose one person. So to talk about the extent to which the Continental Army relies on highly trained European officers, I chose one of those European officers, Baron Steuben, and I talked about his rise and fall, and then I pivoted every now and then to remind you that he's not alone, that he's part of a flotilla led by the Marquis de Lafayette and Casimir Pulaski and Thaddeus Kosciuszko and others, but Steuben was my focus. Likewise, when I was trying to tell the story of the war in the Trans-Appalachian West and the story among native nations, I chose one native person as my lens, a Haudenosaunee woman named Molly Brandt, who you saw an AI-generated image of at the end there, because she makes herself into one of the most important sort of diplomatic linkages between the British and the indigenous people who ally with them. And then every now and then I'd leave Molly Brandt's life for a couple of paragraphs and talk about other indigenous people in other places before returning to Molly's life. So I had to choose carefully, Tyler, and some chapters it made more sense to talk about multiple individuals rather than just one. But when I saw an opportunity to allow you to follow one life for a whole chapter, you can bet I took it.
Great. Thanks, Professor Bell. So I'm going to combo 2 questions together. So Carrie asked, where and how did you find documents that led you to Mosley's fascinating story? And then Robert asks, what was the biggest surprise you found in researching your book?
In some ways, they are the same question, right? Well, at least the way I'm going to answer them will draw parallels, actually. So thank you for those questions and for putting them together, Anthony. So I wish I could tell you that I've spent the last 5 years traveling the world. I wish I could tell you I've been in the Peruvian archives getting my hands dirty. I wish I could tell you I've been to Botany Bay and Sydney doing research for this book on an unlimited travel budget paid for by the University of Maryland during COVID lockdown. But of course, this is instead what's called a synthesis. A synthesis is where an historian, and you see this very commonly, by the way, where an historian tries to wrap his or her arms around a massive and growing body of scholarship put together by experts in a particular field and say something original and new based on their reading of other scholars' work. In the case of the American Revolution, which is always a favorite topic of historians, there are some historians who've devoted their careers to elucidating through archival work the role of indigenous people in the American Revolution. I'm thinking of Kathleen Duval at UNC when I say that, for instance, who wrote a great book about that topic. There are other historians who've devoted their careers to thinking about the connections between the American Revolution and Jamaica. I'm thinking of Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy and Trevor Bernard when I say that. But these historians working in either the indigenous field or the Caribbean field, they don't normally talk to each other. Their work is not normally under the same umbrella. And so I thought now is the time. Now is the time to bring 14 different conversations about 14 different aspects of the globalized American Revolution under one umbrella and see what happens when these conversations, when these people get to talk to each other. And the result is a brand new history of the American Revolution, which incorporates dozens of historians' excellent archival work, but tries to say something new based on my reading of that work. And as you see, I take a strong interest in human lives to draw those lives out whenever I can. So when John Moseley first came across my desk, I was hooked immediately. John Moseley's story has been told only once by only one other historian, and she's one of my favorite historians. Her name is Cassandra Pybus, Pybus. She's an Australian historian, lives in Australia. She's published several journal articles and one short book about Black Americans swept up into the Revolutionary War who end up in Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone and Australia. And her book, sadly, is not widely known outside of historian circles. The book is called Epic Journeys of Freedom by Cassandra Pybus. John Moseley appears for like 2 pages. And then she also wrote a very short article, maybe 10 pages, about John Moseley himself. So when you hear me talking about John Moseley, I'm sharing with you what I learned from Cassandra Pybus's archival research, which sadly has not got nearly the attention it deserves, given how creative it is.
Thanks. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to jump to Vivian's question. When you say that Britain emerged from the Revolutionary War stronger than before, can you illuminate in which ways it was stronger apart from having 500,000 fewer enslaved people? Did it end the war with a huge debt the way France did? And wouldn't its trouncing by France, Spain, and the Patriots have been a big humiliation?
Yeah, so I said arguably stronger, which means we can argue about it, right? And who knows who is right. But I will say that there is certainly a sense from some British commentators at the time that things could have been a whole lot worse, that they could have ceded way more territory to France and Spain, and that by losing 13 mainland colonies that were consuming all of their political attention for the last generation, and yet being able to resume trading with those people almost immediately is like offloading your most troublesome properties without squandering any of the economic, relationship. So what I'm saying is Britain and the US start trading like gangbusters right after independence, and yet Britain doesn't have to protect the US with the Royal Navy anymore. It doesn't have to worry whether every little piece of policy antagonizes people on the ground in the US. So there's a sense that, the US was to some British politicians a sort of albatross around their neck, and they're glad they're rid of it. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect here, but you get the general argument. And then the other point is the one you made in the talk, in your question, Vivian, which is that however Britain exits the war, its largest rivals, France and Spain, exit the war in much worse shape than Britain and much worse shape than they went in. France and Spain spend untold amounts of money and blood and treasure trying to knock Britain to its knees, and yet do not walk away from the global peace settlement in Paris with really much to show for themselves apart from the loss of 13 colonies. And those 13 colonies don't get carved up by France and Spain. France and Spain only get a couple of colonies, the Floridas, basically, out of the peace settlement, which is far less than they thought they would get when they walked in. So France thinks it's going to get British India out of this war. Spain thinks it's going to get Gibraltar back. Those nations get none of those things, thanks to the diplomacy of the British diplomats and Benjamin Franklin, who make a side deal cutting out France and Spain. So I'm saying, Vivian, in comparison to their geopolitical rivals, France and Spain, Britain's stock is rising after 1783, and France and Spain's stock is falling. And if we telescope forward to 1850 or 1900, we can say that the French Empire has collapsed, the Spanish Empire has collapsed, and only the British Empire is still standing. I'm not saying the American Revolution is to blame for all of that, but it's certainly in line with that calculation.
Perfect. Thanks, Professor Bell. It looks like we probably have time for one more question. So I want to shift gears a little bit and focus on the book and kind of moving forward in the future, because two questions were asked that are along the same lines in education. And so Daniel, I'm going to put them together. They're a little long, so if you need me to break it at some point, just let me know. So Daniel asked, has British education in history become less parochial from the time you were in secondary school? Perhaps related, are students in the UK and also the US learning more or less about history since you were a student? And then Jim is asking, you teach in an American university system built around a fairly national story of the revolution. How do students respond when you push them to see 1776 through the eyes of loyalists, enslaved people, indigenous nations, or Spanish officials instead of just the Continental Congress? So really kind of how is your book going to change the way that the American Revolution is taught in schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. Questions plural. Thanks for that. So, I went to school in the 90s, which is a long time ago. I've got lots of gray hairs to prove it, right? It was a while ago. And for the record, I went to a private school in Britain as well, which can do whatever the hell it wants in terms of curriculums. But I will say that I think my experience back in the 90s was broadly similar for most British school children of that era. Everyone I've spoken to about their own experience at roughly the same time have said, yeah, what you saw and heard, that's what we saw and heard as well. I do think times have changed somewhat since then. I have a nephew. He is 12 years old, going on 13. He's in a state school, a public school in London. And I think there is more world history and even a dash of American history in his British and European centric curriculum these days. So my understanding is that my nephew will study the transatlantic slave trade before he graduates K-12, which I never did. And my nephew will study, for instance, civil rights and Martin Luther King, which I certainly never did. So I think things are moving in the right direction in Britain, though they've got a long way to go, because every nation often tells its students, self-serving nationalist stories. The US is in no way unique in doing that. As to my own experience as a professor, I taught this morning at 9 a.m. a class called, wait for it, Globalizing the American Revolution. This is a class either based on my book or the book is based on my class. It's hard to know which is the chicken, which is the egg here. And so I don't want to speak for my students, but I will say that students in previous semesters of this class, and it's been running for 2 years now, have told me in evaluations, wow, why didn't we know this before? Thank you for sharing this, which I take to mean, and I'm reading into their comments a little bit, that young people do not like to uncritically consume the conventional wisdom. Young people like something that disrupts what they thought they knew. Young people are challengers of the status quo. That's what makes teaching young people so exciting all the time. They're constantly pushing back against the man. Sometimes I'm the man and sometimes I'm not, but they're constantly sort of asking difficult questions which expand our knowledge. So I think there's a real appetite for a broader, more complicated, more transnational, more entangled history of America's founding fight, certainly among the student body. And so I hope with this book that folks out there who, buy their book books in Barnes & Noble or at the airport on their way on vacation or from Amazon.com. Take a look at this as well, and approach it with the same sort of open-minded curiosity that most of my 18-year-old students seem to bring. So that's my goal, my hope, anyway.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming in here and sharing with our audience. It's always fascinating. I always learn something new every time we have you here. Just some quick housekeeping things. You can get the book for $35. I'm going to post the link in the chat. Just fill that form out, and then we'll pass you over to Professor Bell. And Mike, you asked about our live classes, if they're coming back. They are. Stay tuned. We'll be coming with an update soon about those. And I want to leave it to you, Professor Bell, if you want to close out with anything.
All I wanted to say is thank you to everyone who signed in on multiple different platforms today, and for Anthony for putting this extraordinary event together. I'm trying to get the word out about this important scholarship right as we're on the cusp of 2026. So take a look if you can, and send me any feedback you have. My email address is readily available. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.